Good morning, and thank you for coming to the First Mondays event of the 2015-16 academic year. My name is Ryan Platt, and I am an assistant professor of performance studies in the Department of Theater and Dance. It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Academic Events Committees, which consists of members from the President's Office, Advancement, and faculty representatives from political science and psychology. Our mission is to help plan events throughout the year that involve the entire campus community. Since its inception, the First Mondays series has provided an exceptional opportunity for everyone in our community, students, staff, and faculty from all disciplines and divisions, to collectively participate in the intellectual life of the college. The selection of First Mondays speakers also employs a collective process and depends on your ideas and input in order to sustain a truly dynamic and diverse range of topics and speakers. With this in mind, the Academic Events Committee welcomes your questions, comments, and most importantly, nominations for First Monday speakers at any time. Even though the year has just begun, it is definitely not too early to start thinking about possibilities for 2016-17. If you have ideas, please feel free to contact us directly or to use the nomination form, which is available on the First Mondays website. On the website, you can also check out the rest of this year's lineup, which this semester includes author, former New York Times ethicist, and pop culture commentator Chuck Klosterman, and the seminal philosopher, feminist theorist, and science studies scholar Donna Haraway. Today's speaker, John Kerry, will be introduced by Professor of Mathematics and Associate Dean of the Faculty, Mike Sidaway. Please join me in giving our attention to Dean Sidaway.
Thank you, Ryan. Welcome, everyone. Thanks to the Idea Space and to Curator-Director Jessica Hunter-Larson and to Kate Leonard in the Art Department Design Research Fund for making John Kerry's visit possible today. True to the ways of Colorado College, I spent the last 5 days driving thousands of miles throughout Western North America. Early autumn favors this big country and brings to mind Woody Guthrie's towering anthem, "This land is your land." The song is full of promise and challenge and provokes us all to question our parts in something bigger than we are. How do we engage our lives in actions that matter? How do we build community? How do we expand those included in the "your" in the title of this great song? All people, all flora, all fauna. With his other songs to back me up, I think Woody would say "your" is all of creation. Let me pull back a little bit to the roles that we play. We all need each other. We're all in this together. And something utterly singular and irreplaceable is lost when we fall short of all we individually can do to make the world better. John Kerry has brought these questions, sensibilities, and convictions to bear on his mighty work in design and architecture. Mr. Kerry is a strategist for TED Prize and co-leader of TED City 2.0, a project focused on the future of cities. He is an advisor to Aspen Global Health and Development and is an advisory board member for Possible Health in rural Kenya. His first book, The Power of Pro Bono, 40 Years About Design for the Good, Public Good by Architects and Their Clients, pulls together work and travels during his 7-year service as executive director of the San Francisco-based nonprofit Public Architecture. John Kerry's work questions, challenges, and provokes. Let me bring this back a little to "This land is your land." There's a verse in which buildings and built places figure that ends with the question, "In the shadow of the steeple, I saw my people. By the relief office, I seen my people. As they stood there hungry, I stood there asking, is this land made for you and me?" John's work inspires each of us to ask, and here I paraphrase, from the introduction to John's book. How do I live my life through my profession so that I empower all people to live their best lives? Truth be told, it was equal parts John's book and All That Big Country that made me think of This Land Is Your Land. It's wonderful to have you here, John. Thanks for your work and the example you set. Welcome to Colorado College.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction. This is a clock. It's a clock that my wife had the both pleasure and great torture of looking at as she lay in a hospital bed for several days while she was giving birth to our daughter. And she would look up at that clock and be like, who put that clock up there? It was the only thing she could see as she's laying there, except for some really bright lights, and she could hear just one beep after another. And we started talking, because we had a lot of time to kill, about who would design a place like that. And one of the nurses walked in and she said, you know what? I don't like this place very much. I wish I had become an architect because I would totally redesign it. And I said to her, an architect did design this space. These are some of the kind of inhumane spaces that architects design, intentionally or not. And as we were laying there looking at this clock, we started thinking about another kind of hospital. This one in rural Rwanda that we had a chance to visit just a year earlier. And it was designed by a Colorado College graduate and an amazing team of people, both Americans and Rwandans, and built in the most unlikely of places in rural Rwanda. It's a former hilltop that figured prominently into the major civil war that we know happened there a couple decades ago. And so it was ironic that we were in Berkeley, California, in what should be a state-of-the-art, world-class hospital, and we're thinking about a hospital that was built in this place that didn't even have electricity until the hospital came along. This hospital serves over 300,000 people in one of the districts of Rwanda. And Alan Ricks, who's going to be speaking here, I think, on the 30th, and is a graduate of CC, can tell you much more about it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this hospital. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a future project that Alan's organization's involved with, and I'm going to tell you kind of how I factor into some of that. This is Maya, by the way. So that clock didn't hurt us after all. She was named after the architect Maya Lin, and since my wife is a journalist, the writer Maya Angelou as well. My wife and I are partners in work and in life. Maya is our greatest creative collaboration, I'd say, but we also host TED conferences and do a lot of philanthropic work and all sorts of other fun stuff, and I'm extraordinarily lucky to have her. One of the things that we do is we mentor a lot of young women and people of color to become thought leaders, because more often than not, people of my demographic are ones invited to speak, as grateful as I am to be invited to speak to you all, but also populating the pages of op-ed sections and newspapers and so on and so forth. And so we work extensively with the most amazing network of people, and we have a little organization we call Fresh Speakers that brings fresh voices to the world. One other thing about my wife is that she's a Colorado native. She was born here and lived on Tejon Street right nearby, and her mom co-founded the Rocky Mountain Women's Film Festival, which is the longest running women's film festival in the US and based here in Colorado Springs. We are not as serious as you might think. We actually have a lot of fun. Our daughter and I dress up a lot, or at least I dress her up. And this was just from yesterday. No, not really. It was 4th of July, red, white, and blue kind of thing. But this is a phrase that means a lot to me. In some of our facilitation work, we go through an exercise called "Why do you do what you do?" which may seem like a really simple question, but you have to like really dig down and think about it. And as I've come to that realization that I do what I do because I believe everyone deserves good design, I've learned more about design from my wife and my daughter than I have from anyone else, including, certainly my own work and all the schooling that I've had. Before my wife and I met, she had 2 Ivy League degrees. She had traveled all over the U.S. and in many parts of the world, and yet she had this belief that design was just a luxury, that it was for the rich, and that it had nothing to do with the kind of social justice advocates that she was writing about and advocating for. And I've helped, I think, introduce the power of design to her, and she's helped to introduce it to entirely new audiences that I would never have the ability to reach, or that most architects and designers wouldn't have either. And so I credit her a lot with the work that I do. So I don't know what design means to you, and there's too many of you to ask in this room, but one of the things that a lot of historians kind of put on the map is this big milestone when in 1998, Apple released this first thing that might be hard for some of you younger students to believe, but this was like a very cutting edge and very compact computer. Of course, now we have more powerful computers in our pockets. But this is something that took a historically beige form that was in every office across the country and probably around the world, and made it fun, made it colorful, designed it. They really put thought into the design. I was just trying to think of things, I'm not from Colorado Springs, but I was trying to think of like other kind of iconic things, and one of them that at least I studied in architecture school was the Cadets Chapel at the Air Force Academy, and so I thought I would stick that in there for local pride. But you know what? There's also spaces and places that are designed that end up looking like this because they're not designed well. So this is a DMV, but it might as well be, it could be a TSA line. It could be any number of other places where, clearly the function has outgrown the form. And so there's a lot of bad design out there, a ton of it. And I see those things as opportunities. You might see them as frustrations. You might, like my wife, not think you have any control over them whatsoever. And I hope that you leave here today knowing that you do and that you can. So design is, just to give you a little bit of a kind of definition that resonates with me. I didn't write this. It resonates with me. It's investigating, it's analyzing, it's engaging users, and it's iterating solutions. And in the case of a building, there's really just one built solution, but there's often a lot of kind of prototypes and models and other things that help both the architects and the clients get to the end point. As an architect, I thought mostly about buildings and public spaces for a long time, but I've since tried to really broaden my interest in design to include products as well as, so again, the things in your pockets, that kind of stuff, but as well as services and systems, whether they're social services or they're kind of processes that people in society have to rely on and go through. So here's an example of a product. This is a product, and I have obviously a big social justice bent, and so the 3 that I'm going to show you here, and actually the rest that I'm going to show you for the rest of this talk, are all in that space. But this is a very low-cost infant warmer for places around the world that can't afford more high-tech, costly, and high-maintenance incubators for babies. And it was designed by a bunch of Stanford University students, and it's called the Embrace Warmer, and it's just this beautiful object. As a young father, I could cry looking at this thing, so I'll spare you. This is a space in the south side of Chicago where foster kids go to reunite with their biological parents. And you can imagine the fear on both sides of the equation. And so the architect, a woman named Jeannie Gang, and her firm designed this beautifully playful, bold, very like child-centered space, and it's one of my favorite places. And then finally, when you think of it like a process or a system, you know, in this case, it's like a sanitation system for rural Ghana, but they weren't just thinking about like what happens from like an immediate sanitation standpoint, but what can you do with that sanitation, and how can you use that to create jobs and create livelihood and create a more sanitary society. And so those are just a few examples. I could have picked any number of them, but I thought I would start with that. So this is all under the kind of broad banner of design for all. And this movement goes back decades. There are architects and designers, just like there are people in every field, that have been doing everything that they could think of to make the world a better place. More often than not, though, a lot of the solutions, mostly conceptual solutions, frankly, that were put forward by the architecture and design fields were things like this. They were, looking at the huge number of shipping containers and saying, well, why don't we convert those into clinics? So a very well-intentioned thought until you actually spend time in a shipping container. Or you have to cut through a shipping container in order to bring in light, or bring in electrical, or HVAC, or whatever it might be. And so this was still the kind of thing that you saw a lot at architecture and design conferences, published in magazines, and celebrated, because compared to a lot of architecture, it is innovative, but it's not innovative enough. And so there were a lot of small-scale solutions like this, and then this architecture student from Harvard, of all places, like the ivory tower of all ivory towers, right, stumbles across campus to the School of Public Health and happens to hear this global health pioneer named Paul Farmer, who's the co-founder of this amazing organization called Partners in Health, talk about not just health, but actually building roads in order to facilitate health, building clinics, building housing for doctors and nurses and others, building schools, in fact, doing all these other things. And so this student named Michael Murphy was just like, hey, I want to go work for the architecture and design firms that you're hiring. And Paul Farmer is like, hey, I've never hired an architect in the 20 years that I've been doing this. The last clinic that we built, I designed on the back of a napkin. And that's not unusual. I think the best in architecture and design services fail to reach the most impactful areas of the social sector. And yet, Paul Farmer was able to think big enough and be generous enough to say, hey, you as a young person and your friends are welcome to give it a shot. So they gave it a shot. They moved to Rwanda, several of them. They lived there on the land with Paul and his team and these doctors as they conceived of this hospital. This place is it's 4 hours from Kigali on like the most treacherous road, comparable to some really treacherous roads that I'm sure you see here in the mountains. And so they couldn't get a big excavator there, not in a timely manner, not in an affordable fashion. And so they dug this foundation for a massive hospital by hand, women and men. And this gives you a sense of what it looks like. There were about 4,000 people employed during the course that this hospital was built. This was a typical day where laborers would come and wait for work. And they did a couple of things. In addition to designing a beautiful hospital that was really centered around the patients and the needs of the doctors, they used all local labor and all local materials. And Jessica, who's my host here from the Idea Space, said to me, you know what, it never occurred to me that that would be such a unique thing. And in fact, it is. It's entirely unique. So often we see materials and labor imported, and you don't see the benefit to the local community as a result. And so MASS, Alan Ricks, and Michael Murphy's organization, has made an early and long-standing commitment to that. And in the process, they've trained this amazing cohort of craftspeople, including this cadre of women masons. There are very few women masons here in the United States. There are even fewer, I can assure you, in Rwanda. There's male masons that end up talking about it in some of the videos that Alan's produced, and it's really remarkable to hear. And this is a wall that these masons built. They take local volcanic rock that is most often just like moved aside because it has no material value, and they made this beautiful, beautiful form, and that's the whole exterior of the hospital. And again, the majority of this was done by women. Really extraordinary. This is what the inside of the hospital looks like. Every single bed, instead of facing that clock that my wife Courtney was able to look at for a few days, every single bed faces out a window into that beautiful landscape. And that too is unique. You don't see any hospitals designed in that way. And so there's just some really simple moves that they made because they didn't know any better to do worse. This is what the hospital looks like, this aerial view. It's just spectacular. It's breathtaking, in my assessment. I had written so much about it that when I finally went there, I thought it can't possibly meet my expectations, and it did. It just completely blew them away and exceeded them. I know that Mass is involved with some facilities work here, so I can't promise this will happen, but they brought this project in under half the budget of the other 9 district hospitals in Rwanda, and in 2/3 the amount of time. It's remarkable. A bunch of students did this. Students, in many cases, about the same age as you. So here's what they do and what good design does. It engages users, it saves money, and it dignifies. And dignity is this term that's kind of bandied about a lot these days in the social sector and in the philanthropic sector. And I actually think it's much more than a buzzword. It's this really powerful, powerful term. And it's this thing that we hope everyone can experience, just a feeling of worth, a feeling that your value is reflected back at you. And there's a million photos now of the Butaro Hospital, that hospital in Rwanda. This is one of my favorites. Somehow, I just see this pride in these women who are either patients or caregivers there. So, Rwanda has interestingly and somewhat ironically become an example for the world. It's also become an example for Africa. And through the work that I do with Aspen Global Health and Development, part of the Aspen Institute based here in Colorado, I was invited along with a small delegation of people to visit Malawi, a country that has many similar challenges as Rwanda, but is many years behind some of the redevelopment that is happening in Rwanda. The majority of people in Malawi are small shareholder farmers. They have one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world, second only behind Sierra Leone. So whereas in the United States, the maternal mortality rate is about 1 in 2,500, in Malawi it's about 1 in 36. So for every 36 women that gives birth, 1 dies. And that's not even speaking of the infant mortality rate. So there's a movement in several countries in Africa to create these structures where women can come out of their homes and out of their villages and closer to critical care clinics. And they understand that shelter is a big piece of that, and the Malawi government did as well. And so this is one, when we visited Malawi and did our field work there, we met with about 50 women just like this, who were inside this concrete box, laying on mats on the floor, about to go into labor or starting to labor already, just kind of crammed in there. And already that was safer for them than giving birth in their villages with the prospect of having to walk hours and hours and hours, sometimes even days, to get to a clinic if they needed it. And I'll never forget meeting these women. I actually took this photo. And this was the photo I took of the new government-sanctioned building that they were creating for these women to be in. And it's super well intentioned, and it's built with brick, valuable material, and there's lots of things that were very well intentioned about it, but there was these small windows, these thick walls. None of us in this room would enjoy being in there, probably, and especially not during one of the most significant and sacred moments of our life, of giving birth. And so I just kind of left there thinking, there's got to be a better way. And, I saw that it was made with care, that it was made with love. I talked to a lot of these people, and I just still couldn't help but thinking of the work that Mass and Alan and others have been doing in Rwanda. And so I had a chance, at the invitation of the government, to present to a totally unintimidating woman who happens to be the president. She was flanked by machine guns, by the way, and I'm sitting here, and actually it was hilarious because I was with all these other heads of state, and they were legit heads of state, like the former president of Ireland, the former president of Latvia, the former vice president of South Africa, and they introduced me as the president of my website. And now the president of publicinterestdesign.org, John Kerry. And I just wanted to run or like crawl under the thing. And I'm sitting there, all these aide people are looking at me, the whole cabinet's there, it's daunting. And I just started to tell her what I'm trying to explain to you about the power of design. And the presentation went remarkably well. I sweat a lot, and I was super nervous, and I don't remember any of it, but I know it went well. And she and her administration effectively gave the green light to try to engage a group like Mass to bring some of its design services. And we found an amazing partner in this doctor who is associated with UNC Chapel Hill Medical School, but lives in the capital city of Malawi, and has the support of the Gates Foundation in order to build several of these maternal waiting homes, as we call them. And his name is Dr. Jeff Wilkinson. He'd never worked with an architect before. He never thought about design before. He was happy to get those boxes, those concrete boxes. And yet he was willing to listen. And he was willing to say, you know what, I do think there's a better way. And so Mass, the first thing that they did was kind of break up what is this big box for 50 women and make it into much smaller, more intimate spaces that in low times where there's not as many women there, family can actually reside in these little small little houses, but they can otherwise hold about 4 women at a time, which is a far cry from the 50 that you would normally see. There's also places to gather and commune. There's places for women to walk around. And they created these renderings. They showed them to the government, which approved them. They showed them to Jeff Wilkinson and the Gates Foundation, and they supported them. And this thing is nearing construction, is nearing the completion of construction. And these are just a few photos of what it looks like. I haven't seen all of Malawi. I've seen a fair amount of it traveling with the president. This is going to be one of the most beautiful buildings in Malawi. And it was built by people from Malawi, and it was built with local materials. And you can just imagine what it's going to do for people, for these women in particular, but also their families to see this space. I think it's going to be really, really extraordinary. This is a total construction photo, but it's got this sense of home. I mean, this is a pretty iconic form everywhere in the world, but especially here in the United States in terms of a form. And this is a beautiful space that these women are going to be able to call home during the time that they're there. So my role in that, again, was not as an architect or a designer. It was as a communicator and a connector. And I pretty much made that connection happen, and I got out of the way. And a year or two later, I simply get these emails that show me what's happened, and it moves me to tears. There's nothing that I could personally design or build that would mean as much to me or to anyone, frankly, as this maternal waiting home, and I hope it's the first of many that are built. So I know that the majority of you in this room won't become designers, and I don't care. I'm not here to proselytize design, or becoming a designer at least, but I love this quote by Frederick Buechner, find where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need. And you can do that no matter what you major in, no matter what you pursue as a career. So I wanted to kind of bring this home a little bit. It's easy, I think, and I've thought a lot more in the past, and I still think so to some degree. It's easy to kind of romanticize work abroad. It's different to do work in Africa and other settings. It's actually, in some cases, harder to do a lot of work in our own backyards for a whole variety of reasons. And yet there's huge needs that exist. So I created a program and directed it for 7 years called the 1% Program of Public Architecture. We are getting architects and designers to pledge 1% of their billable hours to pro bono service. So in addition to working for amazing institutional clients like Colorado College or a hospital or any number of other things, they were pledging 20 hours per employee per year to the public good, working for nonprofits and clients that couldn't otherwise afford architectural services. We've got over 1,200 firms signed on to date, ranging from sole practitioners to some of the largest firms in the country, and we leveraged about $35 million annually in donated services. And so pro bono is well known as a term. If you have mothers or fathers or siblings that are attorneys, they'll know what pro bono is. They talk about it a lot. They have pro bono partners in firms, pro bono clinics in schools. But pro bono is relatively a new term for the architecture field. And so it means for good. That's its definition. That's its translation. And I ended up writing this book about all this work as I was leaving that nonprofit, and we did something strictly through the influence of my wife, who is this writer who was saying, like, hey, you have all these great ideas and thoughts and experiences around the intentions of architects, but the client rarely has a voice in anything that you write. And I'm like, wow, that's profound. You're exactly right. So I set about interviewing with my team every client or user associated with these projects. And of course, they ended up being much more powerful stories, much more powerful narratives than the architects, who were mainly talking about their intention. These clients and users were able to talk about impact, and that was super meaningful. I also got one of probably the nation's greatest graphic designers, if not the world's, to design the book for free. She said, my pro bono projects are my favorite projects. And I think you would hear that time and time again from architects and designers, from attorneys, from doctors who do pro bono work, from lots of other fields. And so we created this book that spoke to the general kind of funding streams of the philanthropic sector: education, health, housing, so on and so forth. And we focused it all in the United States. And we have a couple of projects, I think in Colorado. Maybe I missed that, actually. Sorry about that. But we just wanted to show that work like this could happen here. And so I'm going to breeze through this and try to leave you with a few questions at the end. But this is a housing project in Seattle that was very different than the standard kind of cookie-cutter Habitat for Humanity house. It was a multi-family house with this beautiful butterfly roof, all low-cost materials, all built with volunteer labor, but really designed thoughtfully around the needs of families. This is a women's health clinic that was very different than some of them, where there's a lot of security for privacy reasons or legit security reasons. And they made it beautiful and colorful and a place where kids can come and play as well. That was designed by a firm in San Francisco. I don't know how many of you shop at Goodwill. It's probably the trendy thing to do in college. But there's a lot of people that also shop there because it's really their only option, or they work there because that's their first employment after a difficult time. And Goodwills can sometimes feel like totally overrun with stuff, and sure, you can find some hidden gems, but otherwise they're not curated nearly as nicely as the majority of stores where we buy our most precious and prized clothing. And so a top retail architecture firm designed a Goodwill to look and feel like that. And it really has changed the way that Goodwill Industries of San Francisco thinks about their merchandising. And then there's also, beyond these like pretty spaces, there's also like real functional needs that something like this very large food pantry distribution center in Boston goes through. And yet they worked with the people who are working the line and really came to understand their needs and designed a facility around them, and also for efficiency. This is one of my favorite projects. It's one of 56 New York Public School libraries that was redesigned by some of the top design professionals in New York, all pro bono, because an initiative called the Library Initiative, and they basically saw literacy as like inextricably tied to poverty. And they said if we can get more kids to read, we can hopefully lift a lot of future generations out of poverty. And so they designed these architectural gems in some of the lowest performing New York public schools. And then, there are certainly some innovations in hospital design beyond the one that was in the delivery room where we were at. But this was a big firm that worked with a nonprofit to rethink what the hospital room might be. And then, I think this is one of the last ones. It's one of now roughly 120 homes designed through the Make It Right Foundation in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans. An amazing, very ambitious project that has received as much criticism as it has applause. But if you go there and talk to the residents, they're so proud of these homes. And it has become a kind of Disneyland of architecture, for better or worse. But it definitely was a bold gesture. And again, interviewing some of these homeowners, you really understand how much they appreciate it. So I wanted to leave you, especially you students that are not designers and won't ever become designers or think of yourselves as designers, with a sense of design opportunities that exist for people in a whole array of fields. I'm going to give you a few topics that are front and center in my mind. If anyone looked at the New York Times yesterday, there was the most extraordinary story above the fold, front page, on veteran suicide in the U.S. And boy, this is a military town. I hope that if you read that, it really resonates with you. And all I could think when I was reading that was, this whole system needs to be redesigned. And I don't have the answers to do that. I guarantee that veterans would have a lot of insights on how to do that. I actually have a brother who works for Veteran Affairs. And I just hope that someone in this room, somewhere, someone in DC, somewhere elsewhere, finally takes the initiative to redesign the kind of circumstances that greet veterans when they return. But there's also mental health across the board that needs to be redesigned in this country. There's homelessness at extraordinary rates in our own cities. There's government services that are too difficult, cumbersome, or frustrating for people to access. And there's education financing that, the majority of you in this room are going to encounter as soon as you graduate, in terms of like loan repayment and that kind of thing. We need to totally redesign how these things work for our country to really thrive. Thankfully, there are a few people doing that. In terms of government services, there's this remarkable woman who could have any tech job she wants. And yet she started an organization called Code for America that is taking the best of tech talent and applying them to local civic needs in City Hall across the country. And they do amazing things. They basically hang out a lot. They wear hoodies, like Mark Zuckerberg kind of thing, and they hack, and they just do their thing, and they make government services better. And sometimes it's with hardcore tech skills, coding and otherwise. Sometimes it's by creating an FAQ, a frequently asked questions component for the city of Honolulu for their website, because citizens had requested that kind of thing, and yet they only had questions. They had hundreds and hundreds of questions. So they got a ton of people together to answer those questions. They typed them up, they put them in a database, and they're now fully accessible to the people of Honolulu. It might sound like a really mundane example, but this is the kind of stuff that can actually make government services and thus people's lives better. There's also brigades. You don't have to become a Code for America fellow. There's brigades all over the U.S., and I think there's one in Denver, and I think there's one in Golden, Colorado. But you can do this if you're interested right now. This is an organization you can get involved with right now. This is a remarkable woman named Barbara Bush, who is the daughter of the last George Bush president. And she, too, could do anything she wanted. Instead, she spends most of her time in Africa, and she's co-founded a remarkable organization called Global Health Corps that provides college graduates with a chance to go do really important public health work in clinics and in governments, meaning ministries of health, mostly in Africa and increasingly in other countries around the world. And unlike Teach for America, which is an amazing program that I very, very much admire, where they kind of send people into communities and place them there, Global Health Corps had this way of innovating on it where they have a local fellow who's from there, who has so much local knowledge and shares that with the person who's coming from abroad, and they work together. They also send young African public health leaders to the United States to learn about our health system. And so it's a really reciprocal organization. And then another one in the tech space, I didn't mean to have so many in the tech space, but this is kind of more along the lines of like women and girls empowerment, is this woman named Reshma in New York City who has created an organization called Girls Who Code. And she's basically teaching coding skills to mainly K through 12 girls, and already seen some amazing results. So I just want to give you a sense of like, these are organizations that are designing a better way, a new way to innovate, and they're touching a lot of really important issues. They're servicing a lot of really people who really need their support. And so it may seem, it's often easy when you hear somebody speaking at a podium to feel like, oh, they've got all the answers. I actually have many more questions than I do answers. I want to hear what some of your questions are, but these are some of the ones that I continue to wrestle with, related to this work and related to design more broadly. So how do we foster more collaborations across sectors? How do we make sure that it doesn't require a Harvard graduate student walking across campus and luckily bumping into a lecture by Paul Farmer? How do we get Paul Farmer to reach out for design services sooner? How do we get architects to put themselves in front of people in those positions of power and decision-making power in order to do this work? Another question I have is, how do we just raise people's expectations that they too deserve good design? Because I think so often we just accept it. We just think, oh, this is what we're due, and we're in this room just by virtue of being in this room. We are all privileged people, really privileged people. So imagine somebody who's not nearly as empowered or privileged as we are, trying to ask for something better. It's infinitely harder, and so I still think that that's part of the solution. People really asking for and believing that they deserve better design. And then how do we match our deep gladness with the world's deep need? That Frederick Breukner quote. This is something that if you're a freshman, you've got 4 years to think about. If you're a senior, you've got a year. And if you're a faculty member, I'm sure you think about every time you go into the classroom. But I hope it's something that you continue to reflect on. For me, it changes and evolves almost daily. I'm now pretty far removed from a lot of this design work because of the communications work that I do with TED. But this is, when I come back to my deepest gladness, it's things like that maternal waiting home in Malawi. It's knowing the power of design. And this is just one final quote I wanted to leave you with. What the world needs is people who have come alive. So what will make you come alive? That's by Howard Thurman. And with that, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor. So I want you all to know, very generous applause, thank you. You too deserve good design, just don't ever forget that, and thank you. I think there's microphones set up, so I believe I'm going to get a few questions. We'll see how we're doing. We've got a few minutes, it looks like. Are there any questions from folks in the audience? Yes, why don't you come right up to the microphone. If other folks want to line up, that's fine too. I'm also happy to call on people. Yes?
Hi, my name's Alex. I'm a senior here. And just like you, really in love with good design. I guess relating to all the questions, I think, that you brought up at the end, I think something that I'm confused about with design is that whether it's in conceiving the idea or at the end of the idea, it seems like things are either summed up as this big idea, as this grand solution. And when you really break down a lot of the things we looked at today, and in my opinion, other good design, it comes down to like a series of thoughtful decisions, and sometimes really, really small ideas. that work together.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk about that
Yeah.
in your experience.
Well, I think you're exactly right. I think it's easy to see the finished product and not have any real understanding of what the process is. That's actually one of the beauties of the exhibition in the ideas space that Mass has curated with your staff here. You can see the process, how things were built, who it was built by, that kind of thing. There's a new trend in design called human-centered design. There's a firm called IDEO that is kind of synonymous with the terms design thinking and human-centered design. And that term is much more than just a buzzword as well, but it raises the question like, well, what is design if not human-centered? And I think about that a lot, but yet I've seen so much design that was not designed around the users, was not even designed around like the caregivers in a hospital. For example, that hospital room that I told you about where my wife gave birth to our daughter, it wasn't designed any better for the doctors or the nurses than it was for her. I don't even know who it was designed around. And so I feel like the type of user research, the interviewing, the kind of observation, a lot of the kind of ethnographic skills that my guess is that there's a class here at CC that teaches you, those are the things that distinguish good design. And I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but don't be fooled by the glossy images, including mine. You know, like it's really about the process and the experience, of course. Another question over here. Thank you for your question, though, Alex.
Hi, my name's Nick. My question is a little more focused, especially in your experience in sub-Saharan Africa. It seems like a lot of the designs for these buildings are that while the process of building and the materials are all local, that the design are mostly coming from people outside of that situation. Is that the case? And if so, how do you see, I guess, the transfer of knowledge and the transfer of knowledge so that we can, train architects and designers not just in our own communities, but in their communities as well?
Great question. Super, super thoughtful question. When Michael Murphy and Mass went to Rwanda, there were 12 architects in the entire country. A lot of them had been wiped out by the war. There wasn't a single school of architecture. There weren't architects. There was still building happening for sure, but in terms of building a larger scale facility and not a smaller clinic, they didn't have a lot to work with. So as they were building the school, they founded the first architecture program at the Kigali Institute of Science and Technology in the capital city, and they've since graduated, I think, 4 classes of architects. Multiple Rwandan architects now work with Mass, including at the highest level, at a partner level. But that first hospital was designed by foreigners. I mean, it was designed on site, so that helps a little bit, and it was designed by local materials and built with local things. But it's completely legit in that way. Now that's changing. There were people from Malawi as well as Rwandan architects that have designed and built that maternal waiting home. And so now that we're creating a workforce, in a design workforce, a lot more of that is happening locally. If I take a really optimistic view of it, I do feel like the Butaro Hospital raised standards in Rwanda. It certainly raised standards across all the other district hospitals. It has presumably inspired like a whole new generation of designers over there. But there's also pitfalls, and so I think those are really important questions to ask. You can probably ask some of the same questions if you're from out of state and you want to work here in Colorado Springs. How do you ensure a really dignified, stream or channel for input for local residents here? I'm just trying to help you think through that. But thank you for the question. Really appreciate it. Another question.
Hi. I'm curious about what you have to say about integrating good design if you aren't an architect or designer by formal trade.
That's a fair question. It's probably, maybe it's easy for me to say as an architect, but there's actually a lot of architects that don't want anyone else thinking that they know how to design, right? I have kind of the opposite view. I feel like there are things that we learn. Some of those things take years to learn. Some of those things don't. You can learn them a lot more quickly. And if you look at the kind of human-centered design movement that's afoot these days, it's really all about listening, and it's about asking questions. And you can do that. One of the most, beyond mass design group, there's an organization called IDEO.org. It is a nonprofit spin-off of a very well-known design firm called IDEO that created things like the mouse for the computer kind of thing. And so IDEO.org, in fact, hires mostly non-designers. They hire anthropologists who know how to ask questions. They hire business people. They hire strategists. They hire a whole range of others. But they couch it all under design. And you might not feel any more comfortable thinking about design, coming out of this. I hope you feel at least somewhat. But I do think that if you look at the problems in our world, or even in your workplace, and potentially even in your home, there are design solutions to them. They might not solve everything, but there are design approaches and techniques, and some of those, again, are listening and observation that I think can really go a long way toward improving, our day-to-day experiences. How about a couple more questions? I'm ready. Here we have someone coming down. We have another one coming over here. Great. Thank you. Step right up.
My name's Jessica. So for the last few examples in your presentation, there seemed a little less focused on the physical side of design and more of like designing programs.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit more about that and maybe how physical plays an aspect
Sure.
To the designing programs?
Yeah, you bet. So yeah, I'm trying to break down some walls here. Buildings take years to build. Spaces take a long time to kind of shape. And yet, products have a little bit of a quicker pipeline, the kind of thing you hold in your hand and all that, but those require a lot of resources. But I was trying to show examples of services and systems where design can play a role, where design can improve those services and systems. And when you go into the Code for America office space in San Francisco, it is every bit as cool as the kind of tech lofts where all these new startups are popping up. They do that for a variety of reasons: recruitment and retention of employees who are being, swayed by all the perks of a tech firm, but also because it makes people feel creative, and so it's like, there's definitely, you can see a thread between their space and their programs. And I think that those things are definitely linked. In the case of Global Health Corps, that one is a little bit more, I think designing better health systems for countries around the world is, or with countries around the world, is really important. But one of the other distinctions I neglected to mention is that Barbara Bush was actually started as a design major at Yale, worked at the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, got into public health, and some of her first fellows for Global Health Corps were architects, designers, and engineers. And so, she's kind of played that role of matchmaker or connector in the way that I mentioned when Paul Farmer just happened to bump into Michael Murphy from Mass. Barbara Bush is building that into her system. So maybe the services and system thing is a little bit of a stretch. I'm trying to meet you all where I think you may be, but I'm really just trying to show that there are other opportunities beyond the kind of traditional design tracks. So we'll go maybe one more question. I don't know. I think we're out of time. I'm not positive, but go ahead.
Hi, my name is Louisa McKenzie,
Hi.
and I was wondering what the difficulties are in designing that places are already established, have established infrastructure, because you talked about in Africa, a lot of places there aren't hospitals or there's very little infrastructure, and you talked about the Ninth Ward. That infrastructure got totally destroyed, so there's a lot of opportunity for creativity. Can you talk about maybe redesigning hospitals in places that are established and are in high demand and high use, and kind of the difficulties of getting places that are very user-friendly, or the creativity of your design in places that are established?
Yeah, I can certainly try. Thanks for the question. One of the interesting things about Mass, and it actually relates back to one of the earlier questions that somebody asked about bringing foreign designers to work in a new locale. we actually think that there is a ton that can be learned from places like the Batara Hospital that can be applied here to the United States. And so we call that south to north learning. It's kind of referencing the so-called global north and global south. And you know, I think that that's already a way that innovations in resource-limited settings can be seen by and ideally integrated down the road by you know, hospital renovations, of which there are a lot, as well as new construction in hospitals here. There's another element of this, is a little different spin on your question, where, you know, as I mentioned, there was no electricity at the site of the Batara Hospital or in that entire district until that hospital came along. So that catalyzed that. But there also wasn't a very robust health system, and so they could have built a building that no one visits, but they built demand as well through a more robust health system of community health workers and that kind of thing. And so this also ties back, I think, to the last question. You know, a building is just a building, but a building becomes a space for people when it's activated, when it's fed by, you know, services and that kind of thing. I think we're trained to think of buildings and products and systems, but they're actually all very much integrated, and they need to be in order to really function as optimally as they could. So, are we out of time? Okay, we're out of time. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. I'll be back this afternoon, I guess, right? Thank you.